just 25 minutes ago. Mr. Speaker, there was a time when statements were supposed to be in the hands of the opposition an hour before the statement, then 45 minutes. I do accept, before the Chancellor says it, that in my time there were occasions when he didn't get as much notice as he wanted. All I would say in the nicest possible way, in the spirit of consensus, is that if we could try and get these statements in the opposition's hand rather earlier, then that would be very helpful. However, turning to the substance of his statement, firstly, I welcome the measured approach taken by Sir Alan Budd and his colleagues in the Office for Budget Responsibility in presenting his report this morning. Higher borrowing by the government, as the Office of Budget Responsibility acknowledges today, continues to support the economy. Indeed, without it, there was a grave risk that a recession could have tipped into a depression, and that is why the expenditure was necessary in this country and other countries across the world. But as I've said repeatedly, borrowing needs to come down as the economic recovery is established. Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that the Office of Budget Responsibility has forecast that borrowing will be £30 billion lower than I anticipated in my budget? And doesn't that flatly contradict what the Prime Minister said last week when he said, and I quote, overall scale of the problem is even worse than we thought? And doesn't the report say that lower borrowing isn't just this year, where the OBR forecasts borrowing £8 billion lower than I did, but it is in each and every one of the next 5 years, borrowing is down by over £30 billion in total. Can he confirm whether he and the Prime Minister knew the OBR borrowing forecasts were prior to the Prime Minister making his speech last Monday? If he didn't, he was just plain wrong, and if he did, he owes us an apology. At the election, he and the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, he and the Prime Minister said they had no need to raise VAT. Now that borrowing is actually lower than they thought, is that still their policy? And turning to growth, the OBR has confirmed my forecast for this year, but it has set out a lower growth forecast for future years, just 2.6% next year. And this change is driven partly by what Sir Alan today has labelled recent events, particularly those events in Europe where growth is sluggish at best. Isn't it the case that what is happening in Europe, our largest export market, will impact growth here in the UK? And doesn't that reinforce the need to put in place measures to secure growth here and in other countries in Europe? Doesn't the Chancellor agree that the impact of action taken across Europe to reduce deficits runs the risk of depressing demand, setting back the recovery, unless accompanied by measures to stimulate growth? And doesn't he accept that growth is essential to cut borrowing? Japan provides an example of what happens if you get this wrong. Recovery is choked off, growth becomes stagnant, and debt rises. Mr. Speaker, it was because the private sector was weak as the global crisis hit that the public sector stepped in to support our economy. And Sir Alan Budd and his colleagues understand that point, because in their report today, at paragraph 3.20, he says, and I quote, "Private sector demand contracted sharply in the recession, while government spending contributed positively to GDP growth." So much for the claim that our spending was irresponsible and unnecessary. He says in paragraph 320, "For this year, 2010, it is government consumption and inventory accumulation that makes the largest contribution to growth." In other words, without it, there wouldn't have been growth this year. And the risk is that taking large sums out of the economy is that the recovery will be derailed. And isn't it also the case that confidence is being affected by the scaremongering that we see from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor? The Chancellor will have noticed the survey of business confidence this morning, which shows a reduction in business confidence, and which shows that what he's saying is unfortunately having a very real impact on the economy. Now, the Chancellor asked us to focus on the structural deficit, but he will have read Sir Alan's very clear statement at paragraph 4.40 in the report, and he says that forecasts of cyclically adjusted aggregates are subject to particular uncertainty. In other words, there is a great deal of uncertainty about what the structural deficit is. But if he does take the estimate of structural borrowing from today's forecasts as a barometer of success, he needs to be clear with people what that means. Can he confirm that it is still his policy to remove the entire structural deficit over this Parliament? And if so, can he confirm that on these numbers published today, he would need to find £118 billion by 2014-15. That's £118 billion of spending cuts or tax rises